Jordan very briefly. I will outline what we're going to do. Jordan will speak for about 20 minutes, I think, talking about the topic that he has been doing a lot of work on, and I can tell you this because I've been researching him on the web. After that, I will engage in a short conversation with him, asking some of the questions that emerge from the things that he has said in his presentation. And then finally, we will open for questions from the floor. And the way we do that, you will all, I think, have little golf pencils and pieces of paper. At any point during the session, you want to write down a question and keep it with you. Just before I finish the question and answer period of myself with Jordan, I'll ask you to pass those pieces of paper down to the front. They'll be sort of collated and handed to me, and we'll finish the session with those questions coming directly from you. And I'm sure you will have questions. Briefly, by way of introduction, somebody who really needs no introduction, he was much involved in a television program that had a little bit in common with the radio program that I'm a national host of. He worked at Big Ideas, or with Big Ideas at TVO for quite a while. He was born in northern Alberta, went to university in Alberta, in Montreal, and ultimately at Harvard in Boston, ended up at the University of Toronto, where he teaches in the psychology department. I'll just tell you one more thing about him. There are 3 living U of T professors who are graded in the sort of analysis or the judgment that is passed by students every year as to how good professors are. Jordan Peterson has been named one of the 3 living U of T professors who are life-changing. The experience of working with them is a life-changing experience. I don't know whether this conversation today will be life-changing, but I'm sure it will be a cause for much thought, and it will help you to understand in a different way some of the things that the festival has put together this year as part of its program. Ladies and gentlemen, Jordan Peterson.
Thanks, Paul. The student ratings don't say whether the students' lives changed for the better or the worse. You might wonder which of those is true after hearing this talk. It's pretty rough. If you do a genuine psychological analysis of the human thirst for war, you can't entertain a more brutal topic. And part of the reason that people don't understand it is because you really don't want to understand it. So, despite that, I'm going to use a case history today, fundamentally, to illustrate the state of mind that you have to occupy in order to be willing and ready to commit any atrocity that might be demanded of you under any circumstances whatsoever. The best way to think about the human thirst for war, at least at the level of analysis that I'm capable of, is to think about it as a personality. I mean, lots of the states of mind that possess us can be reasonably thought of as a personality. So if you're angry, for example, you can think of yourself as possessed by Ares or Mars, who's the god of war. Or if you're hopelessly in love and making a fool of yourself, well, then you're possessed by Eros or Cupid or Venus. And that really is how archaic people, pre-scientific people, viewed the proclivity of people to occupy states of mind that were quite different than those that were characteristic of their normal personality. Freud really capitalized on that idea and modernized it in some sense, because Freud viewed the human being as, in some sense, a loosely united collection of sub-personalities, which had a center, which would be the you that you identify with, but all sorts of peripheral creatures surrounding that center, some of which had the center's best interests in mind, and some of which had other people's best interests in mind, and some of which had absolutely neither in mind. We don't tend to conceptualize states of mind anymore as personalities, not in the scientific literature, but we do all the time in literature and drama and movies. And that sort of representation is extraordinarily compelling. Weirdly enough, you'll pay to watch it. And it is very strange if you think about it, because if the specter of pure destructiveness is laid out in front of you on a stage, there's no logical reason to assume that you would voluntarily expose yourself to that and pay for the privilege of doing so. But you do. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, is that you need to know what that personality is, partly so you can recognize elements of it if they manifest themselves in front of you or within you, and partly because you really can't understand good until you understand evil. And so if you're ever wondering why there seems to be such a limited, why good itself seems to be such a limited resource, it's worthwhile remembering that you don't get there without going somewhere you don't want to go first. And so that's where we're going to go today. I'm going to start with a Shakespearean quote. It seems appropriate, from Titus Andronicus, which is a very violent play, a play that's essentially about vengeance. And one of Shakespeare's characters says, "Why should wrath be mute and fury dumb? I am no baby, I, that with base prayers I should repent the evils I have done. 10,000 worse that ever yet I did would I perform if I might have my will. If one good deed in all my life I did, I do repent it from my very soul." It's not the sort of thing that you want to hear someone say to you. We look for reasons why people might be motivated to commit atrocious acts. And given our cultural standpoint at present, we're often looking for sociological reasons. Poverty, which does not breed violence, by the way. Relative poverty, which does. Lack of education, ignorance. We very seldom consider intent or voluntary intent, because the idea is that people could voluntarily and consciously intend destructiveness is a very frightening thought, especially when you realize that if people could do that to the degree that you're a person, you could also do that. And understanding that people could do that and that you could means that you might be morally obliged to undertake a very thorough examination of the motives for your own behavior. You know, you're most likely to be murdered by someone in your own family. And that's worth thinking about, because the romantic vision of family is one of peace, tranquility, and mutual care, which doesn't jive exactly well with the highest risk for being killed. As a clinician, I've seen family situations that were so terrible that you would have had to be insane to be sane within them. Murderous underground currents of resentment and rage manifesting themselves over decades, painted over with a facade of loving kindness and benevolence. Horrible. The personality that I want to talk about today, it's composed of a downward spiral. And I think that's why people have always envisioned hell in some sense as a bottomless pit. Hell is a bottomless pit because no matter how bad it is, there's some stupid thing you can do to make it worse. And so the spiraling is indicative of a positive feedback loop where A causes B and B causes C and then C causes A and everything moves out of control. The case study that I want to present to you today is one of the more literate of the Columbine killers, whose name was Eric Harris. People wonder why the mass shooters do what they do, which in some sense is quite surprising to me, because if you read what they say, they tell you why they do what they do. Now, why people don't believe that is not clear to me, except that I think that if you do take them at their word, it raises all sorts of specters that we would rather have hidden. Eric Harris became possessed, I would say, of his own free choice by a personality that was composed of ideological rigidity, pride, resentment, deception, and vengefulness. I'm going to read you some of his comments about government systems. When people do analysis of the Nazi state, again, generally the analysis is conducted at a socio-political or economic level. The economic analysis and our obsession with it is probably a hangover from our familiarity with Marxist analysis, which really hasn't gone out of style in some sense, especially in the universities. It's sort of switched from economic reasons motivate everything to reasons of power motivate everything, which is basically the same argument, slightly differently phrased. One thing that's not addressed by that level of analysis is, why would you find the Nazi actions and intent attractive, personally? Not as a sociological puppet, but as a free-thinking, reasonably conscious being characterized by free will. Here's Harris's comments with regards to ideological rigidity. Like the early Nazi government, my brain is like a sponge, sucking up everything that sounds cool and leaving out all that is worthless. That's how Nazism was formed, and that's how I will be too. Hitler and his head boys messed up a few times, and it cost them the war. But I love their beliefs and who they were, what they did, and what they wanted. I love the Nazis too. By the way, I can't get enough of the swastika, the SS, and the Iron Cross. It's not that he didn't understand the Nazis. He understood them perfectly well. Whatever else you might say about Eric Harris, he wasn't stupid. Pride. People. Parents, cops, God, teachers telling me what to do, think, say, act, and everything else just makes me not want to do it. That's why my nickname is Rebel. Reb, actually. No one is worthy of anything unless I say they are. I feel like God. I wish I was. Having everyone being officially lower than me. I already know that I'm higher than almost anyone in the world in terms of universal intelligence. I feel ever more confident, stronger, and more godlike. And I have confidence in my ability to deceive people. I have thought too much, realized too much, found out too much, and I'm too self-aware to just stop what I am thinking and go back to society because what I do and think isn't right or morally accepted. No, 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 I would sooner die than betray my own thoughts. But before I leave this worthless place, I will kill whoever I deem unfit for anything at all. This is from Paradise Lost, the great poem by John Milton. These are the words that he puts into the mouth of Satan after he's flung from heaven for daring to oppose and attempt to transcend the Most High, as his desire was not only to be like God, but to be superior to God. And in some sense, he's a symbol. In some very important sense, he's a symbol or a representation, you could say, which is more accurate, of the ultimate in intellectual pride, which says, everything I know is sufficient, and there's nothing transcendent beyond that. Milton has Satan say, Farewell, happy fields where joy forever dwells. Hail, horrors. Hail, infernal world. And thou, profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. Resentment. I've noticed in my clinical practice that there are three characterological elements that really do people in. And weirdly enough, they're not really listed in the psychiatric list of diagnosis. And they're often also not discussed as causal elements in the genesis of mental illness and suffering, even though in my experience they're actually the primary causes. Arrogance, which is I already know enough. Deceit, which is I can twist the fabric of reality in my favor for my individual wants, and I can get away with it, which goes along with pride and arrogance. And then resentment, which is the world is tragic, which is of course true. The world is unjust and tragic, which is more debatable. And the injustice and tragedy of the world is aimed at me, specifically and unfairly. Well, that's just not true at all. Resentment. I hate you people for leaving me out of so many fun things. And no, don't say, well, that's your fault. Because it isn't. You people had my phone number. And I asked and all, but no, no, no. Don't let the weird-looking Eric kid come along. Oh, no. You people could have shown more respect, treated me better, asked for my knowledge or guidance more, treated me more like a senior, and maybe I wouldn't have been as ready to tear your heads off. Milton, again, Paradise Lost, has Satan say, the more I see pleasures about me, so much more I feel torment within me. As from the hateful siege of contraries, all good to me becomes bane, and in heaven much worse would be my state. But neither here seek I, no, nor in heaven to dwell, unless by mastering heaven supreme, nor hope to be myself less miserable by what I seek, but others to make such as I, though thereby worse to me redound. For only in destroying do I find ease to my relentless thoughts. Eric Harris again. Then again, I have always hated how I looked. I make fun of people who look like me, sometimes without even thinking, sometimes just because I want to rip on myself. That's where a lot of hate grows from. This is Richard III from Shakespeare. Richard III. I shall despair. There is no creature loves me, and if I die, no soul will pity me. Nay, wherefore should they, since that I myself find in myself no pity to myself? Deception. You know what? I feel like telling about lies. I lie a lot, almost constantly, and to everybody, just to keep my own ass out of the water. And by the way, I don't think I'm doing this for attention, as some people may think. Let's see. What are some big lies I've told? Yeah, I stopped smoking. Yeah, I'm sorry for doing it, not for getting caught. No, I haven't been making more bombs. No, I wouldn't do that. And of course, countless other ones. Yeah, I know that I hate liars, and I am one myself. Oh well, it's okay if I'm a hypocrite, but no one else. Because I'm higher than you people no matter what you say, and if you disagree, I would shoot you. If you take the personality elements that we've already discussed and you mix them up and you let them run as a process, you get the positive feedback loop that I was describing earlier, and it has something to do, it goes something like this. And I learned this in part from the analysis of the story of Cain and Abel. In Genesis, the first story about real human beings is the story about Cain and Abel, because Adam and Eve were made by God, right? So, you know, you can't really call them normal humans. Cain and Abel are the first humans. And Cain is very resentful and deceitful and vengeful. And the reason for that, which it's clearly explained in the story, is that Cain's sacrifices aren't accepted by God. Now, it's hard for modern people to understand what a sacrifice is, because why would you offer up to God some burnt remnant of an animal, for example? But, you know, people a long while back acted things out before they could understand them. And they had a more concrete view of the world. I mean, they assumed God was in the cosmos, because if you look up in the night sky, especially if it's dark, it overwhelms you. You see the transcendent and the infinite. And so it's the sensation and experience of that that allows for the attribution of God and his dwelling place to the heavens. So that's not so ridiculous, because you do see the infinite when you're out under the sky at night in the dark. And if God's up there, since smoke rises, if you burn something, well, God can tell if what you're offering is of quality or not. Now, we have the psychological equivalent, which is, I ask my students, what sacrifices did your parents make so that you could go to university? And of course, they can answer that in no time flat. And whether that sacrifice worked depends on how well the child does at university. But what that essentially means is that the sacrifice of the parents found favor, well, with reality, but you can substitute God for that with no loss of meaning. And so modern people obviously believe that if you sacrifice properly, then reality will shine its benevolent face on you. Otherwise, we wouldn't work. So we're not so different from those archaic people. Now, Cain makes sacrifices, and God doesn't like them. Now, the story's a bit ambivalent about why. It might just be that God's arbitrary. I mean, there's no shortage of arbitrariness on the part of God in the Old Testament, which is part of the reason that modern people have trouble with that book, because they say, well, I could never believe in a God who's that arbitrary or even cruel. But the ancient Israelites weren't that foolish. They knew that life could be that arbitrary and cruel no matter what you believed. So it could be that God just has it in for Cain, or it could be that Cain is just not really offering up the best quality sacrifices. And so he's trying to pull one over on God and everyone else. And in fact, that is what God accuses him of. If you read the story very carefully, Cain is mad because Abel's getting everything. Everyone loves Abel. Lots of crops, his flocks are flourishing, all the girls love him, plus he's a really good guy. So you can't even hate him with good conscience, which is extremely annoying, especially to Cain. So Cain goes and has a chat with God, and he says, what kind of stupid place have you made here? He means reality. I'm like working myself to the bone, and you know, all I get is the dregs, and then there's old Abel out there, and you know, everything he touches turns to gold. What's up with you? Which is kind of arrogant if you think about it, right? Because he is talking to God after all, and it isn't clear that Cain understands everything about being, and there's always the possibility that it's Cain's fault and not God's, but that isn't a hypothesis that Cain is willing to entertain. So God says to him, basically, sin, which means to miss the bullseye, by the way, crouches at your doorstep like a predatory and sexually aroused hunting cat. And you invite it in and let it have its way with you. By which he means not only is Cain attacked by sin, so to speak, but that it's a creative union sort of attack. Sin comes in and Cain plays with it and develops it and puts his own twist on it. He produces something new out of it. It's obvious to Cain that God isn't willing to take responsibility for the terrible state of being as a consequence of this accusation, and that makes him extremely mad. Extremely mad. And he kills Abel. And then if you follow the story closely, you can see that God tells everyone else to leave Cain alone. Don't kill him. And the reason for that is that there's a propensity for that kind of vengeful killing to expand exponentially out into the community, which in fact is what happens in the story of Cain and Abel. And the last one of Cain's descendants named is actually Tubal-Cain, and he is, by tradition, the first person who makes weapons of war. So the idea is that individual resentment manifested as homicidal rage is the precondition for the spread of that mode of being into the broader community, and the danger there is that it will degenerate into everyone against everyone. Harris. Moral is just another word, and that's it. I think we are all a waste of natural resources and should be killed off. And since humans have the ability to choose, and I'm human, I think I will choose to kill and damage as much as nature allows me. So take that. Eat napalm and lead. Someone's bound to say, what were they thinking when we go natural-born killers, or when we're planning it? So this is what I'm thinking. I have a goal to destroy as much as possible, so I must not be sidetracked by my feelings of sympathy, mercy, or any of that. Keep this in mind. I want to burn the world. Now, part of the reason that Cain kills Abel is because Abel is favored by God. And so Cain is actually not only taking revenge against Abel and against his own insufficiency and against suffering, he's actually taking revenge against God and being itself. And that's actually what he wants to do. Hate. I'm full of hate, and I love it. I want to grab some weak little freshmen and tear them apart like a wolf, show them who's God. Strangle them, squash their head, bite their temples into the skull, rip off their jaw, rip off their collarbones, break their arms in half and twist them around. The lovely sounds of bones cracking and flesh ripping. So much to do and so little chance. God, I want to torch and level everything in this whole area, but bombs of that size are hard to make. And plus, I would need a fully loaded A-10 to get every store on Wadsworth and all the buildings downtown. Picture half of Denver on fire, just from me and vodka, who was his partner. Napalm on sides of skyscrapers and car garages blowing up from exploded gas tanks. Oh man, that would be beautiful. Yes, the human race is still indeed doomed. It just needs a few kickstarters like me. If I can wipe a few cities off the map, then great. If you recall your history, the Nazis came up with a final solution to the Jewish problem. Kill them all. Well, in case you haven't figured it out yet, I say, kill mankind. No one should survive. So I'll close this brief case history with a quote from Goethe, from Faust. And in Faust, the figure of Satan is played by Mephistopheles. And Mephistopheles, in Goethe's formulation, is a very arrogant intellect. And he has a credo, which is the articulated formulation of the values that he lives by. The spirit eye that endlessly denies, and rightly too, for all that comes to birth is fit for overthrow as nothing worth. Wherefore the world were better sterilized. Thus, all that's here is evil recognized is gain to me, and downfall, ruin and sin, the very element I prosper in. So you can see in that the actuality is not only what Harris wrote and meant, but also what he did and what he was planning to do, which was much more destructive than what he actually managed. You see his state of possession by a set of infinitely destructive desires and wishes. And you see the continual representation of that pattern of action and thought in literature. That's evil versus good. Classically, that's what the world is. That's what the cosmos is. It's a place where evil and good continually battle, eternally battle. And although we don't believe in such things anymore, or more accurately, we don't know what we believe, we still are inclined to watch that drama present itself on stage in endless variations. And the reason for that is that it's true. You can't understand the human capacity and desire for atrocity without viewing it through a metaphysical lens. You can't understand someone like Eric Harris or the countless others who are possessed, so to speak, in exactly the manner that he was without using dramatic or religious language, because you cannot formulate either the question nor the answer with enough profundity without that kind of representation. Now, I wouldn't say that the motives that I've discussed constitute the only reasons for the human thirst for war, but I can tell you that you'll never understand the desire for atrocity without coming to grips with the problem of evil. Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, I'll begin by asking a few questions and then throw it open for questions from you. So please write out your thoughts on those pieces of paper, and we'll collect them in a few minutes. I want to begin, I guess, sort of where you began. And I'd never heard the words of Eric Harris before, and I have to tell you I found them chillingly frightening. It was interesting, though, to then hear you quote and have the quotation so apposite and so perfect, matching, quoting from Milton and quoting from Paradise Lost, I believe. My undergraduate memory of studying that masterpiece is that, and I think this is a school of critical thought as well, Milton apparently liked Satan more than he liked any of the other characters in that amazing work.
Well, that would be the modern interpretation.
Why would that be modern, and what do you mean by that?
Well, because Milton was a genius, and the way he represented Satan in Paradise Lost was as a rebel. And he didn't paint him in black and white, so to speak. He gave him all the attributes that an admirable rebel would have. And people enjoy identifying with the figure of the admirable rebel. But what Satan was rebelling against wasn't what an admirable rebel would rebel against. He wasn't rebelling the way Christ, say, rebelled in his time against the increasing tendency of the religious state to become dogmatic and tyrannical. Satan was rebelling against the idea that there was something that exceeded his power and that was transcendent. Well, human beings do that all the time, especially modern human beings. So the idea that Satan's an admirable character, I think, can't be placed at Milton's feet. He opened the door to that interpretation. And that's a good thing, because part of, for a momentary embodiment of the eternal desire to obliterate everything. Right.
And those are characters that exist. I mean, Eric Harris is not alone there. So he had partners in Columbine.
He has admirers on the web of no small number. And not only does he exist out there, he also exists in here. Like, the thing that he represents, the thing that he embodied, is not, it's a permanent element of the human psyche. It's ineradicable. So we've known this for centuries. So, for example, there's an old Egyptian story that basically plays the same role in Egypt that Christianity played in the West. It's a foundational story. The Egyptian messiah, for lack of a better word, whose name is Horus, overcomes his evil uncle, Set, in a battle. And Set, the name Set, turns into the name Satan over time, by the way. But even though he overcomes Set, he can't kill him. He has to banish him, because Set's immortal. And the best you can do is push him over the horizon for the time being and stay awake. But the probability that that will come back it's eternal, it's archetypal, it's structural. So, and why it's structural, Harris does a good job of explaining. Everyone knows that life is tragic. And everyone knows that to exist is to suffer. And One logical and appropriate response to that is to be grateful in spite of your suffering and attempt to make the best of it, and perhaps to alleviate that where you can. And another is to take the perspective of Mephistopheles and to say, no, the whole thing's flawed right from the beginning. If this much suffering is the price of being, then we should just eradicate the whole mess. And people think like that all the time. Like Harris was thinking like that permanently by the time he did what he was doing. But such thoughts enter the theater of people's imagination very, very frequently. It happens, for example, if a family member falls prey to some unforeseen and undeserved catastrophic occurrence. It's the sort of thing that makes you question whether existence itself has any value. And no wonder. The problem is if you draw the conclusion that suffering itself invalidates the moral claim of reality to exist, what happens to you is that you instantly become an agent that makes suffering far worse. And so it's not a coherent argument. You can't say that you're the advocate of obliterating something that you're in the process of multiplying.
I'm curious, you work not only as an academic, a professor of psychology, you also have a practice, you have a clinical practice. Is there any possible use for these great icons of Western or Eastern, any literature, which all have in them, as you say, this sort of balance or opposition of good and evil? Is there any possible clinical use for that?
Oh, if you see people who are really in trouble, like really in trouble, you can't address their problems without using archetypal language. It's not possible. So, for example, I had a client who lived in a web of lies that was pretty much infinite. I tried for years to get to the bottom of it, familial lies. The lie was, we love you and we're helping you. When the truth was, you should have been born a boy and we've hated you ever since you were born. But we're not going to tell you that, and we're not going to let anyone else know that because we need a facade of benevolence. You know, and for her, this person, to even begin to understand what was going on in her family, there was no escaping archetypal language. I mean, it was hellish. People died in that house, and I made very little headway. Every time I got to the bottom of some absolutely horrendous betrayal, betrayers were in Dante's Inferno. They were right in the center of hell, right? They were the worst of the criminals, so to speak. I'd get to the bottom of some god-awful, decades-long, brilliantly played betrayal, and there'd be another one at the bottom of that. So
I can see what you mean by the spiral, going ever down.
oh, yeah. Things, well, we know this, too. It's weird. There's a law that the economists know called they call it the Matthew principle, weirdly enough, which is derived from the New Testament. And it's derived from one of the harshest sayings of Christ, which is, to those who have more, everything shall be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. And it's an observation, essentially, that both improvement and decline occur in a nonlinear fashion. You know, once you want to improve your life and you're working very hard at that, then you set in motion all sorts of processes that support you, and that speeds the process up ever more rapidly. But if you're declining, exactly the same thing happens. And you might say, well, that's not fair, but, well, it doesn't matter, fundamentally. If it's fair, it is what happens. And so
I was wondering specifically, though, whether you'd actually used texts in conversation with patients.
Yeah.
So you would
definitely
talk about Faust.
Well, you know, lots of my patients have come from religious backgrounds. I mean, one of them was a relatively unsuccessful chaplain who was suddenly fired from her job and then was hit by a car. So that wasn't a good day.
All in one day?
Yes. And there was no escaping the religious dimension. I mean, the thing about the religious dimension sits at the bottom of life. I mean, people don't understand that. They think it's a set of superstitions. It's like, it's not a set of superstitions. Or if it is, then you might ask yourself, well, why do you continue to go see it played out time and time again on stage? What, are you just entertaining yourself? It's like, you're not. Whether you know it or not, you're educating yourself. You're seeing near archetypal representations of the structural elements of human behavior laid out for you by geniuses dramatically. And part of the reason that you get the information that way is that you're not smart enough to understand it abstractly, and neither is anyone else. It's so complicated that even now all we can really do is see it played out. It's very difficult for us to transform that into fully articulated philosophy. Like, it took me 15 years of work, 3 hours a day, to develop the ideas that, and really, like, that was every day. I was thinking about this obsessively for decades. And it took me that long to reach the level of articulation where I could tell the sort of story I told today. It's like, it's complicated material. And so it's also predicated on the idea, which I believe to be true, is that reality itself is a forum for action. It's not a place of objective things. And I believe that. I also believe that if you're a true Darwinian, you have to believe that, because Darwin believed that we are selected for survival as a consequence of our actions. And so our actions are what actually constitute the fundamental truth. You live or die by your actions. Well, actions have patterns. We have character. We have a nature. That's why that's why dramatic representations can be distributed worldwide and everyone understands them. And we understand them in some sense innately. And we're drawn to them. I remember I showed Pinocchio to my son when he was about 4. Pinocchio is a story about confronting chaos and rescuing history in order to become a genuine human being. That's Pinocchio goes to the bottom of the ocean to confront chaos in the form of a whale, and he rescues his father, and that makes him a fully developed human being. That's a story that the Egyptians told 4,000 years ago. It's a very old story. My son must have watched that 30 times. He was really, in some sense, obsessed with it. Well, not really. Pinocchio has so much information in it, you can barely begin to calculate it. And, you could tell that by watching its effect on someone whose mind was just starting to develop. And he was terrified of that whale, but he wouldn't stop watching it. We used to tell him, keep your eye on the hero. Right, because, should you show your children frightening things? Well, the world is frightening. You're going to shelter them from that? Then all you do is launch them out into the world like edible prey. It's a bad idea. So, you have to tell the children what to do, and that's to keep your eye on the hero. Because despite the fact that it's dangerous, he prevails. That's the story of humanity. It's not, well, the hero's, quivering at the back of the cave, waiting for someone else to do the dirty work. So, yeah, these things are real, and I use them all the time in my practice. They work better. There's a personality dimension, a formal dimension known as openness. And open people, they're generally smarter people, because IQ predicts openness. But openness is actually a better marker of creativity. And if you're doing therapy with creative people, and I often am because they come to see me because they've watched my lectures, say, then there's no escaping archetypal discussions. Their dreams are archetypal. I think the reason that Carl Jung, who was very interested in archetypal psychology, why his psychological method worked with his clients was because they were all creative. If I have clients who are not creative, which I often do, because creativity, by the way, is quite rare, this is seldom necessary, and it's not generally neither appreciated nor comprehended. So the archetypal level isn't necessary for everyone, and I don't start there. Like, I start with, well, do you have a job? Because otherwise you're not going to be happy, because you're going to be starving and chased by bill collectors. I start extraordinarily practically. So, knowing as I do that some people who are sad aren't depressed, they just have terrible lives. Right, so you try to fix up their life and then see if they're depressed. So, and that's a practical matter.
I guess I'm wondering how we might take the archetypes you're talking about in literature and theater, in art, in creative world, and somehow connect them with the other kind of world we're watching all the time on television. And as you say, we are in a world where many of these things are being acted out right before our eyes. And it's horrifying to watch. It's horrifying to watch television, for me these days anyway, as it would be to read Eric Harris's journals. And how could I connect what I might learn?
Look, some of the greatest writing that was done about the atrocities of the 20th century was done by one set by psychologists, another set by I would say, literary figures. The two of the people that I've concentrated on substantially were Viktor Frankl and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And so Solzhenitsyn is sort of like Frankl on steroids, you know. Frankl is Solzhenitsyn light, which is really saying something because Frankl's work is very serious, you know. And Frankl really, in some sense, was the first modern thinker to formulate the presupposition that much of what laid the precondition for the rise of the Nazi state and the atrocities that accompanied it was people's willingness to engage in lies. And little lies, so to speak. They're not that little. Solzhenitsyn developed that to a tremendous degree. He wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago in the mid-1970s, and he basically memorized that book when he was in the prison camps, and it was like 2,700 pages long, little bitty type. You know, it's like a 2,700-page scream. That's a long time to scream. His basic claim was the reason that the Soviet state was developed and maintained was primarily because people in their day-to-day lives were willing to lie constantly to support it. And so, I mean, I tried to take apart the reasons for atrocity and warfare. Particularly, I was trying to understand how the world could have come to the point in about 1984 where we were locked in MAD, right, mutual assured destruction mode. I thought, how in the world is it that that we could have constituted the world so that we're aiming at each other's mutual destruction with a weapon capacity that was exponentially beyond that? It seemed like a mystery. And I tried different levels of analysis, you know, because my first degree was political science, so I tried political and economic and sociological, and until I got to the psychological and then to the psychodynamic, I didn't really have much luck. Because you see, what I was trying to understand, for example, wasn't so much territorial war. You know, I can kind of understand you have something, I want it, so, you know, I'll push you out of the way. Animals do that. I mean, it's by no means right, but it's understandable. But there are endless stories, say, about occurrences in the 20th century, some of them that you can't even read without developing post-traumatic stress disorder, of gratuitous violence. So one example that's always haunted me, it's an example from Auschwitz, was the game that the guards used to play there where, you know, the people that were being incarcerated would arrive at the camps, and of course they're already terrorized and half dead or completely dead, and ripped out of their lives and thrown in with people they don't understand and whose language they don't speak, and demolished in multiple ways. And, you know, they'd have them carry wet sacks of salt on their backs from one side of the compound to the other and back. It's like, okay, just exactly why do you want to do that? Well, that's a messy question. You know, and I don't think you can understand it until you understand the part of you that could do that. And one of the horrifying things about this line of investigation is that that part exists, and you could understand it, but you probably won't, and it's no bloody wonder. So, when I started the psychological investigation, there's only a few people whose thoughts I thought were sufficiently profound and historically rooted to take these sorts of ideas with deadly seriousness. And Jung was like that, and of course he's persona non grata for the general psychological community, for the academic community, because he takes these sorts of things seriously. I mean, you'd think that the death of several 100 million people in the 20th century might have indicated that they might be taken seriously, but and then Solzhenitsyn, Frankl, Nietzsche was very helpful. I read a lot of mythology, a lot of work on comparison. It's religious because it's the grammar. You know, you can't go any deeper than that. That's how things are. Like the human being, the archetypal human being is a hero voluntarily confronting the unknown. That's what we are. And if we're not that, we're something else. And that is not a good thing. And like this, I think this is indisputable. I think that even all the biological evidence supports the conceptualization of man writ large as that creature. That's how our brains are set up. That's how we generate information. We occupy the cognitive niche. We're constant explorers and transformers. We transform ourselves continually. We can change our identity, you know, and that usually requires a relatively painful death and rebirth, right, which is an archetypal theme.
It's also something that, and I think this is what's really interesting about what you're saying. I would say, and I may be mischaracterizing civilization or 21st century political reality, but many people, I think, given the fact, and you say it's a fact, and I think it is grounded in something really archetypal and perhaps really just really basic DNA, there's evil and there's good. Most people would want to say, okay, let's work on getting rid of evil. And I think
Good luck.
I think you're saying no, that's not what you have to do.
Oh, no, I think that is what you have to do, but you don't do it by getting rid of other people's evil. You do it by getting rid of your own. Like I can tell you an experiment you can try. This is a great experiment. Two of them. One is, try not to say anything that isn't true for a month. You know, and you say, well, what about white lies? It's like, well, you know, that's your problem. You see if you can figure out how to. So, you know, you might say, your wife says, how do I look in this dress? And, you know, you don't think she looks very good, and so you say, well, you look great, honey, and that's real good. But that isn't the right answer. The right answer is something like, don't ask me manipulative questions. I know that's look, it's a little harsh, eh? And I wouldn't actually formulate it that way. I would say, well, you know, I don't answer questions like that, or something like that. So the truth wouldn't be that, you know, you look hideous in that dress and only a moron would wear it. That's not the truth, you know. The truth is more sophisticated than that. And, you know, people are telling lies all the time to spare other people's feelings, and they have all sorts of good reasons for it. It's like, there are no good reasons for lying. You pollute your speech by lying. And one of the most fundamental presuppositions of Western culture, and this is, I think, perhaps the most brilliant discovery human beings ever made, is that chaos is transformed into order by the word. And you are all speakers of the word. And if you want chaos to be transformed into hell, then lie. If you want chaos to be transformed into heaven, then tell the truth. You know, so I see people, for example, among my clientele who are caught in mini tyrannies, you know, at work. Because a lot of fascism in our culture isn't government level, it's sort of workplace level, you know, petty tyranny. And so I see people who are absolutely miserable at work because they're being bullied by bullies or by policies that are, you know. I can give you an example. One of my clients gave me an email string from the corporation she worked in. And it was like 30 exchanges about the word flip chart, which you'd think would be a rather harmless word. Flip chart, everybody knows what a flip chart is. It's a little, you know, large paper pad that you turn, harmless object. Turns out that flip is a hypothetically pejorative word for Filipinos, and so then there was the idea that, well, maybe the Filipinos who were hearing flip chart were being offended by that, and so that maybe that should be a banned word. It's like, my client was a sensible person, you know, she was an Eastern European, she was well educated. I mean, this was just killing her, you know, because I mean, petty tyranny under the guise of universal benevolence, right? Flip chart. Jesus. Unbelievable. Well, I've heard the same thing. Blackboard, that's off the list. Well, it's black, and then you can't use the word master key. because, well, that's about masters, and, it's good God, But she had very much difficulty opposing it. She wouldn't say, "You are criminally stupid," but I mean, you don't have to. The problem is, by the time you've been pushed to the point where you have to say that, it's too late, right? All the people in that corporation made these little tiny micro decisions that they barely even noticed that they were going to put up with that nonsense. And if they would have rubbed it out when it first popped its ugly little head up, when it was just a little shoot of a perverse plant, they would have stopped it cold right there, because there's no force behind that kind of petty tyranny. As soon as you put up a hand, you stop it. But no one puts up a hand. It's like, okay, well, if you want your workplace to turn into hell, then just put up with it. And so it does, fighting evil does matter, but it's not corporations. Some of them are evil, obviously. Some of them aren't, It's not corporations, it's not socio-political structure, it's none of those things. It's like, fix up your speech, fix up your family. And then if you can manage that, which is very difficult, then maybe you could dare to start thinking about something more complex than the family level of organization. I see students all the time whose lives they're a god-awful mess, and they're out protesting about something that's destroying the world. It's like, well, if we put you in charge, well. Yeah.
I'll ask one more question, and then perhaps if you could start passing the questions that you have down to the front. And this question, I guess it comes out of an autobiographical experience of my own, but the time when I first realized many of the things that you're talking about today was very real. And I was working on a CBC radio program, which later won a number of awards. It was called Children of Innocence, and it was about children during the Second World War. And the criteria for selection for people in the program was that they had to be under 15 years of age in 1945. So it was the war from their experience. And I went many places, but the place that it literally, and I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it, remembering it, was literally getting off a train and walking into Auschwitz. And suddenly, everything was almost too real. And I'm wondering if you have such a personal experience that brings it all home to you.
For me, it was nightmares, really. And for some reason, when I was probably 17 to 25, something like that, I had continual apocalyptic nightmares. Mm-hmm. And they were brutal, really brutal. And the fact that they were occurring, that was a real experience, right? Dreams are real. They're not real external world, but they're real. And they were of sufficient emotional force to compel me to understand how the conditions of the world could have become so nightmarish. I've had moments that are analogous to that in my clinical practice. I worked for a very brief time at a maximum security prison in Edmonton with a very peculiar psychologist, very interesting person, who later disappeared. He was on a bus from Manitoba home, and he disappeared. No one ever heard from him again. Anyways, he'd introduced me to this relatively harmless-looking prisoner, and then left, which I wasn't very comfortable about. He'd left me in this gym that was full of muscle-bound monsters, and I was a pretty skinny little rat at that point. And then this guy came and said that the psychologist had asked him to come and rescue me or whatever, and we went for a walk out into the yard, and we were getting farther away from this gym, and I was thinking, this is probably not that good. And then the psychologist showed up and called me back, and then I'd found out that guy, 5'2", skinny little rat-like guy, had shot 2 policemen in the head while they begged for their lives and told them that they had kids. It's like, wow. It was the dissociation between the person that I met and that act that that really made me think. It's like, so normal. It's like the banality of evil, right? Except I think Hannah Arendt got it backwards. It's not the banality of evil. It's the evil of banality, right? So evil hides under the banal, and it certainly did in his case. So that was one of the direct experiences that mostly made me think about my own capacity for resentment and deceit and vengeance and violence and, ingratitude and all those things that are a very prevalent part of the human existence.
And something we should all be thinking about all the time, or at least a lot.
Well, you have to decide what you're up to. And you're either trying to make things better or worse. That's it. Those are the options. And if you're trying to make them worse, there's a reason. And if you're trying to make them better, there's a reason. And so, in some sense, you decide which side you're on. And then you decide how much you're on that side. And a huge part of being on that side is truth. It's the fundamental virtue. Without truth, you don't know where you are. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know who you are. Plus, you really hurt people with mistruths. Like, the worst thing you could do to someone who's mentally unstable is to lie to them. Because they're barely clinging on to the edge of reality as it is, You throw some more garbage in there, here's a stone, and it turns out to be like a paper bag floating on a pit. You just do them in. And you do in your kids with lying, and you do in your spouse with lying, and it's a really bad thing. And, you think you can get away with it. It's like, I can tell you one thing I learned in my clinical practice. I've never seen anyone get away with anything. Like, whatever you say that isn't right will come back to haunt you. By that point, you might be so warped and demented and clued out because you filled your head with garbage that you don't notice the causal connection. There's a lot of psychoanalysis is, oh, it was that caused that. It's like they're decades apart. It's like, yeah, that was the causal chain, so it's easy to ignore. And the only reason you think you can get away with anything is pride. It's like, I'm smart enough to twist the fabric of reality in my favor. It's like, yeah, okay, go ahead, see what happens. It's like, the outcome will not be pretty. Even if you get what you want doing that, you'll find out that it doesn't do for you what you thought it would. So, it's a fool's victory.
First question from the audience. Should Eric Harris be your patient? How would you or should you structure your treatment of him? And what do you think the prognosis might be?
Well, he couldn't have been my patient because in order to be a patient of a psychologist, you have to want to get better. So Carl Rogers, for example, who was a great psychologist, identified the initial preconditions for successful therapeutic conversations. And the first precondition was the person had to want to get better voluntarily. So they had to know there was a problem, they had to know that maybe it had something to do with them, and they had to want to fix it. And then the second was they had to be willing to have an honest conversation. Now, one of the things that's quite strange, and I think this is what Rogers noticed as well, was that you can't do that thing for the person. They have to do that before they come and see you. So, like, I've had people who were remanded by the courts to see me. One of them was a child molester who was pretty psychopathic and narcissistic, and it was just bloody hopeless. Like, I wasn't making a dent in that guy because he wasn't there voluntarily. And there's no change in someone who doesn't want to be changed. You're just a fool to try. That's pearls before swine, fundamentally. So Harris, in the state that he was in, there's nothing that could be done. So, unless, maybe you get him on a day where little of that humanity is still floating about, but he'd have to come for treatment himself. So.
Second question. Do people tend to take from plays views that reinforce their own position, even when the play expresses a contrary view?
Oh, that's a really good question. We actually did an experiment about that. One of my students, who was a very interesting person, she tested to see whether, imagine you provided someone with some information and you did it like a court transcript, so just factual, or you used a literary representation. She took a Chekhov play, Chekhov short story, and then transferred it into an objective court transcript, trying to remove all the literary elements from it. And what we found was that the original short story had a more transformative effect, and in the positive direction. So yeah, one of the things that's so interesting, art and literature are truly subversive, because first of all, if it's art, it's not propaganda, because if it's propaganda, then that's a conscious attempt to change the way you think or look. But if it's art, then what's happening is the artist is trying to figure something out. Well, he or she is engaged in the act of artistic production, and then the art object is the result of that exploratory attempt. And the thing about exploring with art is you're always exploring things that you don't know, because otherwise why would you be exploring? And so part of the reason that art is subversive is because it exists on the border between articulated knowledge and the unknown itself. Like, it's the place where articulated knowledge is born. And it's very difficult to criticize art, right? I mean, you can say, well, one painting's better than another, but like, what I mean by that is even nihilistic punk rockers like music, right? Music seeps in. It's like music helps them celebrate life to the degree that nihilistic punk rockers are capable of doing that. And they won't criticize the music. Like, maybe they don't like the lyrics or whatever, but you're just an idiot if you criticize music as a phenomenological, entity. Like, dance is the same way. These things are, in some sense, they're beyond criticism, because you actually don't know what they're about. So, yeah, art is really subversive or transformative, but that's the same thing. So,
I wonder if it's the same thing. Can you switch that from the world of art or creativity and into the world that you deal with when you're dealing as a clinician with your patients? I mean, does it take a while for a patient to realize that they're exactly the opposite of what they think they are, of how they've created themselves?
Often, when a transformation that dramatic is necessary or possible, it often occurs as a consequence of dream analysis. Mm-hmm. So, one of the things I've noticed, again, because I have a disproportionate number of creative clients, is that creative people have very well-structured, coherent dreams that are very frequently archetypal in nature. And often, the reason that they decide to change is because the dream lays out a situation in a manner that's comprehensible that they can't argue about. It's like, dream is a phenomena of nature. It says this is the way it is. It's like, you want to believe that or not? You don't have to, but it's not like it's biased against you. It's just something that happened to you. And so that sort of information, it wells up from within, is often very compelling, and it's very difficult to criticize. It's like, it's analogous in some sense to a spontaneous intuition, and those often emerge with the force of at least small revelation. So they carry with it sufficient emotional meaning and momentum to be convincing in and of themselves. So,
this is a question that brings us right up to the present day, I suppose. What should be done in Gaza? How do we look at that conflict properly?
I don't have an answer for that. I don't think there's anything I can do about Gaza, or alternatively, I'm doing everything I can about Gaza by talking to you here today. And my conclusion was, as I mentioned before, when I was trying to figure out what level of analysis was appropriate to conceptualize the greatest of moral problems, so Gaza's situation is a good example of that, I always ended up at the individual level. So I would say, if you want to help the situation in Gaza, be more truthful with your spouse. And you'd think, well, how can that be connected? But I can tell you how it's connected. You're more connected to other people than you think. So, we don't live in linear relationships with one another. We live in networked relationships. So each of you is connected, for example, pretty directly to about 1,000 people. over the course of your life, 1,000 people. It's more than that probably. But then you think, well, each of those 1,000 are connected to 1,000. So that's 1,000,000. So you're one person away from 1,000,000 people. And then those 1,000 know 1,000, and so you're 2 people away from 1,000,000,000 people. And you know, the thing that's interesting about a network is that it has as many centers as there are nodes. And this is something Solzhenitsyn made explicit, but one of the implicit presuppositions of the Judeo-Christian tradition is that each soul is a center of the cosmos. You think, well, can that be true? It's like, God only knows what's true. What we know about consciousness, you could put in a thimble. We know nothing about consciousness. We haven't advanced in our understanding. In fact, we may have gone backwards over the last 400 years. Like, I mean, we know nothing about the relationship of the brain to conscious awareness, or virtually nothing. Bits and pieces here and there. Consciousness is an absolute mystery. And God only knows where it came from or what it's up to. I mean, we know some things about human being. We are fundamentally explorers of the unknown. That's how we're built. We take things apart and put them together, and you know, and we communicate the results of that, and we find pleasure in that. But don't underestimate the utility of getting your life together. I mean, besides, you can do that. Besides, you're not going to hurt anyone if you do that. You'll just make things better. Plus, it's kind of humble. It's like you can sweep underneath your bed. You know, you don't have to go out and wave a placard around. I'm against poverty. It's like, who's for poverty? You know, so I think you want to fix the world, fix your life. It's a lot harder than you think, right? It says in the New Testament, it's harder to rule yourself than to rule a city. Well, why? Well, it turns out you're more complicated than a city. It also turns out that you're more important in some sense than a city. And it also turns out to matter what you do with your life. It matters for you, and it matters for everyone else. And it probably matters for the destiny of being. I mean, that's what it means in some sense to be made in God's image. So, and you know, you think, well, I don't take that stuff very seriously. It's like your whole legal system is predicated on that idea. So don't be saying you don't take it seriously. You know, you presume that you have intrinsic value. It's a presupposition, right? Well, what does intrinsic value mean? It's grounded in something. It's transcendent value. And even if you don't believe in it, you act it out. And you'll be very annoyed if anybody interferes with your transcendent value. So who cares what you say you believe? What do you know about yourself? You know, we wouldn't have psychology if we were transparent to ourselves. We wouldn't have drama. You know, just because you believe something about who you are doesn't make it true. So.
What does testosterone have to do with war? Do women have this personality of warfulness?
Testosterone doesn't really have much to do with it as a biochemical. Generally, men with higher levels of testosterone tend to be more dominant. They don't tend to be more aggressive. So, and there's a difference between dominance and aggression. It's a good difference. Often dominant men are competent. And, you know, if you really think about it, you actually want the competent people to be dominant because otherwise nothing gets done, and that's not good. So, you know, are women warlike? Well, part of the answer to that is we actually don't know, because they have never, in rare cases, commanded the resources of armies of women. You know, that's never been a historical possibility. Certainly, Margaret Thatcher was plenty warlike, you know, and so was Golda Meir. So, and to associate femininity with benignity that's foolish. Like, women are just as corrupt and evil as men. They're just as good too, and you know, there's lots of bullying among girls at school. They don't punch each other. They're more, in some sense, they're more subtle than that. Yeah. They backbite and exclude, and you know, there's all sorts of little tricks that they use. And certainly, women are no more prone to tell the truth than men. Often their agreeableness, because women are more agreeable than men technically, makes them conflict avoidant, and people who are conflict avoidant won't discuss unpleasant truths because it causes conflict. And so women have just as big a moral burden to bear as men. So
this is back to Eric Harris. What parenting or educational practices help to develop such extreme arrogance as displayed by somebody like Eric Harris?
In the Pinocchio movie, which, like I said, which is a very archetypal movie, Pinocchio has a good father, eh? That's Geppetto. He's a good guy. He likes music. He's a craftsman. He kind of has his act together. Plus, he wants the best for his son because he wishes on a star. I wish my son could be a real boy, right? Geppetto's a good guy. And then the Blue Fairy, which is sort of the mother in that movie, she's sort of on Pinocchio's side too. So Pinocchio really has the best of two worlds. He's got a good father and he's got a good mother. But he's still prone to all sorts of catastrophes. Like, I mean, first of all, what happens to him first of all? Oh yeah, he becomes a puppet. That's worth thinking about. It's the opposite of being real. You're someone's puppet. They're pulling your strings for reasons of their own. And he does that because he wants to become famous without work. And then, basically, he's tempted into being what's equivalent to a Nazi on Pleasure Island. And then he's tempted to use his own neurotic weakness as an excuse to be useless. And he also gets through that, although not without turning into a braying jackass, right? Which is kind of the end state for many teenagers. So, no, I mean that. I mean that because, you know, when you're a kid, a little kid, there's something perfect about you. And then, but you go out into the world and you get all bent and twisted while you're being socialized. It's inevitable. You know, there's no getting socialized without getting bent and twisted. And so when you come out of that, you're neither a fully developed member of society nor an individual. You're sort of some weird hybrid, unhappy hybrid. And that's necessary, and then it's up to you to do something about that. It's not self-evident that it was parenting per se that produced Harris, you know, and I would hesitate to lay responsibility at his parents' feet. People make choices. And this is a rough one, because we don't have the science for that, because the science says, well, it's got to be causal in some factors, so you look at sociological or economic causes, and, you know, there's all these deterministic events on the social side and on the natural side, nature and nurture. That's all you are, is nature and nurture. It's like, well, maybe not. You're also actually nature, nurture, and consciousness. And consciousness seems to be able to make choices. And the choices seem to matter. So you can come from a pretty wretched family and a pretty wretched social circumstance where absolutely everything is stacked against you and come out pretty damn good. George Washington Carver is a good example of that. He was the son of slaves just before slavery came to an end. One day, when slavery was still in force, some bandits swiped him and his mother from the farm they were on. And he was so sickly and weak that they dropped him off at the next farm. So, you know, he was born into slavery, plus he was so sickly and weak that even someone who was a slaver didn't want him. It's like, as far as nature and nurture go, that's a pretty rough beginning. But, you know, his life was exemplary. I mean, he invented all sorts of new agricultural techniques. I mean, he invented peanut butter, for example, which you know, in some sense it's sort of comical. But inventing a new thing to eat is a big deal, you know. He fed a lot of people. And he got educated, and he went to university, and he did all these things that were they were impossible, you know. And he did it without bitterness. It's like, good work. Explain that. There's lots of resilient people, you know. So here's another example. Most people who abuse their children were abused as children. Causal, right? Well, no. Most people who were abused as children don't abuse their children. The causality only works when you go from the abused back. Okay, so the pool of abused people is high. Most of them don't abuse their children. But if you look at child abusers, small pool, most of them were abused. But you're not talking about the whole continuum. Most people who were abused don't abuse. And you know that because if they did, think about it. If they did, it would spread exponentially. And then everyone would be being raised by seriously violent, abusive parents. And it would take no time at all. Like, it'd take a few generations and poof, everyone would be a violent abuser. It's like, that doesn't happen. So weirdly enough, the horrors of history don't necessarily accumulate and become transferred. And I've seen this in my own practice. Like, I have one client who, she had a pretty nasty upbringing. Her mother pretty much did everything she possibly could to make sure that she had no real self-confidence. And what she learned from that was not to do that to her son. And she raised an excellent son. It's like she had every reason to, you know, perpetuate her misery as a consequence of resentment. And she has some resentment, and it's not surprising, but she swore, man, I'm not gonna do this to my son. And she did a great job. Like, I know her kid quite well, and she didn't overprotect him. That's pretty good. He tells the truth. He's on a career. You know, he's got his career going. He's a straightforward young guy, and he likes his mom. You know, so good deal. But account for that causally. The problem is, and this is something Nietzsche observed a long time ago, any event can produce multiple causal pathways. Well, not any event, but, you know, any complex event. So, determinism? I think the world's too complicated to be deterministic. So.
As you can see, I have many more questions, but I'm also supposed to be the timekeeper here, and we're running out of time. I'm going to invite Kira back to close the session and formally thank Jordan Peterson.
Thank you so much, Paul and Jordan Peterson. Big ideas indeed, and it's fantastic. So as you might know, the forum continues here at Stratford for the rest of our season. Please, I encourage you to see multiple productions of our that we have on offer this year, including Mother Courage and her children. There's a few events that are coming up in the coming weeks that you might be interested in. James Orbinski from Doctors Without Borders is coming on Friday. He's doing a presentation on madness inside and outside the edge of war. So a related topic. It's this Friday at 11 a.m. at the Tom Patterson Theatre. On Saturday, it's your last chance to see Shalina Kennedy in concert, and that's here on Saturday, August 2nd at 11. And next week, as part of the same series that this is part of, Dr. Marina Adshade is coming for an event related to the Beau Stratagem, our production of the Beau Stratagem, looking at the relationship between sex, money, and marriage. And she'll be joined by company members Sarah Farb and Bethany Gillard, who are both featured in that production. So that's next Wednesday at 11 here in the studio. Thank you again to CBC Ideas. And we have been live streaming this event, so you can watch it again on our website if you'd like, the recorded version. Thank you very much again for coming. Jordan Peterson, Paul Kennedy.